Part 4. 7 ways to cultivate a mental attitude that will bring you peace and happiness. Chapter 12. 8 words that can transform your life. A few years ago, I was asked to answer this question on a radio program. What is the biggest lesson you have ever learned? That was easy. By far the most vital lesson I have ever learned is the importance of what we think. If I knew what you think, I would know what you are. Our thoughts make us what we are. Our mental attitude is the X factor that determines our fate. Emerson said, "A man is what he thinks about all day long." How could he possibly be anything else? I now know with a conviction beyond all doubt that the biggest problem you and I have to deal with, in fact almost the only problem we have to deal with, is choosing the right thoughts. If we can do that, we will be on the high road to solving all our problems. The great philosopher who ruled the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius, summed it up in 8 words that can determine your destiny. Our life is what our thoughts make it. Yes, if we think happy thoughts, we will be happy. If we think miserable thoughts, we will be miserable. If we think fear thoughts, we will be fearful. If we think sickly thoughts, we will probably be ill. If we think failure, we will certainly fail. If we wallow in self-pity, everyone will want to shun us and avoid us. You are not, said Norman Vincent Peale, you are not what you think you are, but what you think you are. Am I advocating an habitual Pollyanna attitude toward all our problems? No, unfortunately, life isn't so simple as all that. But I am advocating that we assume a positive attitude instead of a negative attitude. In other words, we need to be concerned about our problems, but not worried. What is the difference between concern and worry? Well, let me illustrate. Every time I cross the traffic-jammed streets of New York, I'm concerned about what I'm doing, but not worried. Concern means realizing what the problems are and calmly taking steps to meet them. Worrying means going around in maddening, futile circles. A man can be concerned about his serious problems and still walk with his chin up and a carnation in his buttonhole. Now, I've seen Lowell Thomas do just that. I once had the privilege of being associated with Lowell Thomas in presenting his famous films on the Allenby Lawrence campaigns in World War I. He and his assistants had photographed the war on half a dozen fronts, and best of all, had brought back a pictorial record of T.E. Lawrence and his colorful Arabian army, and a film record of Allenby's conquest of the Holy Land. His illustrated talks entitled "With Allenby in Palestine and Lawrence in Arabia" were a sensation in London and around the world. The London opera season was postponed for 6 weeks so that he could continue telling his tale of high adventure and showing his pictures at Covent Garden Royal Opera House. After his sensational success in London came a triumphant tour of many countries. Then he spent 2 years preparing a film record of life in India and Afghanistan. After a lot of incredibly bad luck, the impossible happened. He found himself broke in London. I was with him at the time. I remember we had to eat cheap meals at the Lyons Corner House restaurants. We couldn't have eaten even there if Mr. Thomas had not borrowed money from a Scotsman, James McBay, the renowned artist. Now here's the point of the story. Even when Lowell Thomas was facing huge debts and severe disappointments, he was concerned but not worried. He knew that if he let his reverses get him down, he would be worthless to everyone, including his creditors. So each morning, before he started out, he bought a flower, put it in his buttonhole, and went swinging down Oxford Street with his head high and his step spirited. He thought positive, courageous thoughts, and refused to let defeat him. To him, being licked was all a part of the game, the useful training you had to expect if you wanted to get to the top. Our mental attitude has an almost unbelievable effect even on our physical powers. The famous British psychiatrist J.A. Hadfield gives a striking illustration of that fact in his splendid 54-page booklet, The Psychology of Power. I asked 3 men, he writes, to submit themselves to test the effect of mental suggestion on their strength, which was measured by gripping a dynamometer. He told them to grip the dynamometer with all their might. He had them do this under 3 different sets of conditions. When he tested them under normal waking conditions, their average grip was 101 pounds. When he tested them after he had hypnotized them and told them that they were very weak, they could grip only 29 pounds, less than a third of their normal strength. One of these men was a prize fighter, and when he was told under hypnosis that he was weak, he remarked that his arm felt tiny, just like a baby's. When Captain Hadfield then tested these men a 3rd time, telling them under hypnosis that they were very strong, they were able to grip an average of 142 pounds. When their minds were filled with positive thoughts of strength, they increased their actual physical powers almost 50%. Such is the incredible power of our mental attitude. To illustrate the magic power of thought, let me tell you one of the most astounding stories in the annals of America. I could write a book about it, but let's be brief. On a frosty October night, shortly after the close of the Civil War, a homeless, destitute woman who was little more than a wanderer on the face of the earth knocked at the door of Mother Webster, the wife of a retired sea captain living in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Opening the door, Mother Webster saw a frail little creature scarcely more than 100 pounds of frightened skin and bones. The stranger, a Mrs. Glover, explained that she was seeking a home where she could think and work out a great problem that absorbed her day and night. "Why not stay here?" Mrs. Webster replied. "I'm all alone in this big house." Mrs. Glover might have remained indefinitely with Mother Webster if the latter's son-in-law, Bill Ellis, hadn't come up from New York for a vacation. When he discovered Mrs. Glover's presence, he shouted, "I'll have no vagabonds in this house," and he shoved this homeless woman out of the door. A driving rain was falling. She stood shivering in the rain for a few minutes and then started down the road looking for shelter. Here's the astonishing part of the story. That vagabond whom Bill Ellis put out of the house was destined to have as much influence on the thinking of the world as any other woman who ever walked this earth. She is now known to millions of devoted followers as Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. Yet until this time she had known little in life except sickness, sorrow, and tragedy. Her first husband had died shortly after their marriage. Her second husband had deserted her and eloped with a married woman. He later died in a poorhouse. She had only one child, a son, and she was forced because of poverty, illness, and jealousy to give him up when he was 4 years old. She lost all track of him and never saw him again for 31 years. Because of her own ill health, Mrs. Eddy had been interested for years in what she called the science of mind healing. But the dramatic turning point in her life occurred in Lynn, Massachusetts. Walking downtown one cold day, she slipped and fell on the icy pavement and was knocked unconscious. Her spine was so injured that she was convulsed with spasms. Even the doctor expected her to die. If by some miracle she lived, he declared that she would never walk again. Lying on what was supposed to be her deathbed, Mary Baker Eddy opened her Bible and was led, she declared, by divine guidance to read these words from St. Matthew. "And behold, they brought to him a man sick of the palsy lying on a bed. And Jesus said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. Arise, take up thy bed, and go unto thine house. And he arose and departed to his house." These words of Jesus, she declared, produced within her such a strength, such a faith, such a surge of healing power that she immediately got out of bed and walked. That experience, Mrs. Eddy declared, was the falling apple that led me to the discovery of how to be well myself and how to make others so. I gained the scientific certainty that all causation was mind, and every effect a mental phenomenon. Such was the way in which Mary Baker Eddy became the founder and high priestess of a new religion, Christian Science, the only great religious faith ever established by a woman, a religion that has encircled the globe. You're probably saying to yourself by now, this man Carnegie is proselytizing for Christian Science. No, you're wrong. I am not a Christian Scientist, but the longer I live, the more deeply I am convinced of the tremendous power of thought. As a result of many years spent in teaching adults, I know men and women can banish worry, fear, and various kinds of illnesses, and can transform their lives by changing their thoughts. I know. I have seen such incredible transformations performed hundreds of times. I have seen them so often that I no longer wonder at them. For example, one of these incredible transformations, which illustrate the power of thought, happened to one of my students. He had a nervous breakdown. What brought it on? A worry. This student told me, I worried about everything. I worried because I was too thin, because I thought I was losing my hair, because I feared I would never make enough money to get married, because I felt I would never make a good father, because I feared I was losing the girl I wanted to marry, because I felt I was not living a good life. I worried about the impression I was making on other people. I worried because I thought I had stomach ulcers. I could no longer work. I gave up my job. I built up tension inside me until I was like a boiler without a safety valve. The pressure got so unbearable that something had to give. And it did. If you have ever had a nervous breakdown, pray God that you never do, for no pain of the body can exceed the excruciating pain of an agonized mind. My breakdown was so severe that I couldn't talk, even to my own family. I had no control over my thoughts. I was filled with fear. I would jump at the slightest noise. I avoided everybody. I would break out crying for no apparent reason at all. Every day was one of agony. I felt that I was deserted by everybody, even God. I was tempted to jump into the river and end it all. I decided instead to take a trip to Florida, hoping that a change of scene would help me. As I stepped on the train, my father handed me a letter and told me not to open it until I reached Florida. I landed in Florida during the height of the tourist season. Since I couldn't get in a hotel, I rented a sleeping room in a garage. I tried to get a job on a tramp freighter out of Miami, but had no luck, so I spent my time on the beach. I was more wretched in Florida than I had been at home, so I opened the envelope to see what Dad had written. His note said, "Son, you are 1,500 miles from home, and you don't feel any different, do you? I knew you wouldn't, because you took with you the one thing that is the cause of all your trouble, that is, yourself. There is nothing wrong with either your body or your mind. It is not the situations you have met that have thrown you. It is what you think of these situations. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. When you realize that, son, come home, for you will be cured." Dad's letter made me angry. I was looking for sympathy, not instruction. I was so mad that I decided then and there that I would never go home. That night, as I was walking down one of the side streets of Miami, I came to a church where services were going on. Having no place to go, I drifted in and listened to the sermon on the text, "He who conquers his spirit is mightier than he who taketh a city." Sitting in the sanctity of the house of God, and hearing the same thoughts that my dad had written in his letter, all this swept the accumulated litter out of my brain. I was able to think clearly and sensibly for the first time in my life. I realized what a fool I had been. I was shocked to see myself in my true light. Here I was, wanting to change the whole world and everyone in it, when the only thing that needed changing was the focus of the lens of the camera, which was my mind. The next morning, I packed and started home. A week later, I was back on the job. 4 months later, I married the girl I had been afraid of losing. We now have a happy family of 5 children. God has been good to me, both materially and mentally. At the time of the breakdown, I was a night foreman of a small department handling 18 people. I am now superintendent of carton manufacture in charge of over 450 people. Life is much fuller and friendlier. I believe I appreciate the true values of life now. When moments of uneasiness try to creep in, as they will in everyone's life, I tell myself to get that camera back in focus and everything is okay. I can honestly say that I am glad I had the breakdown because I found out the hard way what power our thoughts can have over our mind and body. Now I can make my thoughts work for me instead of against me. I can see now that Dad was right when he said it wasn't outward situations that had caused all my suffering, but what I thought of those situations. And as soon as I realized that, I was cured, and stayed cured. Such was the experience of this student. I'm deeply convinced that our peace of mind and the joy we get out of living depends not on where we are or what we have or who we are, but solely upon our mental attitude. Outward conditions have very little to do with it. For example, let's take the case of old John Brown, who was hanged for seizing the United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry and trying to incite the slaves to rebellion. He rode away to the gallows, sitting on his coffin. The jailer who rode beside him was nervous and worried, but old John Brown was calm and cool. Looking up at the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, he exclaimed, "What a beautiful country! I never had an opportunity to really see it before." Or take the case of Robert Falcon Scott and his companions, the first Englishmen ever to reach the South Pole. Their return trip was probably the cruelest journey ever undertaken by man. Their food was gone, and so was their fuel. They could no longer march because a howling blizzard roared down over the rim of the earth for 11 days and nights, a wind so fierce and sharp that it cut ridges in the polar ice. Scott and his companions knew they were going to die, and they had brought a quantity of opium along for just such an emergency. A big dose of opium, and they could all lie down to pleasant dreams, never to wake again. But they ignored the drug and died singing ringing songs of cheer. We know they did because of a farewell letter found with their frozen bodies by a searching party 8 months later. Yes, if we cherish creative thoughts of courage and calmness, we can enjoy the scenery while sitting on our coffin, riding to the gallows, or we can fill our tents with ringing songs of cheer while starving and freezing to death. Milton, in his blindness, discovered that same truth 300 years ago. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Napoleon and Helen Keller are perfect illustrations of Milton's statement. Napoleon had everything men usually crave, glory, power, riches, yet he said at St. Helena, "I have never known 6 happy days in my life," while Helen Keller, blind, deaf, dumb, declared, "I have found life so beautiful." If half a century of living has taught me anything at all, it has taught me that nothing can bring you peace but yourself. I'm merely trying to repeat what Emerson said so well in the closing words of his essay on self-reliance. A political victory, a rise in rents, the recovery of your sick, or the return of your absent friend, or some other quite external event raises your spirits, and you think good days are preparing for you. Do not believe it. It can never be so. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, warned that we ought to be more concerned about removing wrong thoughts from the mind than about removing tumors and abscesses from the body. Epictetus said that 19 centuries ago, but modern medicine would back him up. Dr. G. Canby Robinson declared that 4 out of 5 patients admitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital were suffering from conditions brought on in part by emotional strains and stresses. This was often true even in cases of organic disturbances. Eventually, he declared, these traced back to maladjustments to life and its problems. Montaigne, the great French philosopher, adopted these 17 words as the motto of his life. A man is not hurt so much by what happens as by his opinion of what happens, and our opinion of what happens is entirely up to us. What do I mean? Have I the colossal effrontery to tell you to your face, when you're mowed down by troubles and your nerves are sticking out like wires and curling up at the ends, have I the colossal effrontery to tell you that under those conditions you can change your mental attitude by an effort of the will? Yes, I mean precisely that. And that is not all. I am going to show you how to do it. It may take a little effort, but the secret is simple. William James, who has never been topped in his knowledge of practical psychology, once made this observation: action seems to follow feeling, but really action and feeling go together, and by regulating the action, which is under the more direct control of the will, we can indirectly regulate the feeling, which is not. In other words, William James tells us that we cannot instantly change our emotions just by making up our minds to, but that we can change our actions, and that when we change our actions, we will automatically change our feelings. Thus, he explains, the sovereign voluntary path to cheerfulness, if your cheerfulness be lost, is to set up cheerfully and to act and speak as if cheerfulness were already there. Does that simple trick work? Try it yourself. Put a big, broad, honest-to-God smile on your face. Throw back your shoulders, take a good deep breath, and sing a snatch of song. If you can't sing, whistle. If you can't whistle, hum. You will quickly discover what William James was talking about, that it is physically impossible to remain blue or depressed while you're acting out the symptoms of being radiantly happy. This is one of the little basic truths of nature that can easily work miracles in all our lives. I know a woman in California, I won't mention her name, who could wipe out all of her miseries in 24 hours if she only knew this secret. She's old and she's a widow, and that's sad, I admit, but does she try to act happy? No, if you ask her how she is feeling, she says, "Oh, I'm all right," but the expression on her face and the whine in her voice say, "Oh God, if you only knew the troubles I've seen." She seems to reproach you for being happy in her presence. Hundreds of women are worse off than she is. Her husband left her enough insurance to last the rest of her life. She has married children to give her a home, but I've rarely seen her smile. She complains that all 3 of her sons-in-law are stingy and selfish, although she's a guest in their homes for months at a time. And she complains that her daughters never give her presents, although she hoards her own money carefully, for my old age. She's a blight on herself and her unfortunate family. But does it have to be so? That's the pity of it. She could change herself from a miserable, bitter, and unhappy old woman into an honored and beloved member of the family, if she wanted to change. All she would have to do to work this transformation would be to start acting cheerful, start acting as though she had a little love to give away, instead of squandering it all on her own unhappy and embittered self. H.J. Englert of Tell City, Indiana, is still alive today because he discovered this secret. 10 years ago, Mr. Englert had a case of scarlet fever, and when he recovered, he found that he had developed nephritis, a kidney disease. He tried all kinds of doctors, even quacks, he informed me, and nothing could cure him. Then, a short time ago, he got other complications. His blood pressure soared. He went to a doctor and was told that his blood pressure was hitting the top at 214. He was told that it was fatal, that the condition was progressive, and he had better put his affairs in order at once. I went home, he says, and made sure that my insurance was all paid up. Then I apologized to my Maker for all my mistakes and settled down to gloomy meditations. I made everyone unhappy. My wife and family were miserable, and I was buried deep in depression myself. However, after a week of wallowing in self-pity, I said to myself, "You're acting like a fool. You may not die for a year yet, so why not try to be happy while you're here?" I threw back my shoulders, put a smile on my face, and attempted to act as though everything were normal. I admit it was an effort at first, but I forced myself to be pleasant and cheerful, and this not only helped my family, but it also helped me. The first thing I knew, I began to feel better, almost as well as I pretended to feel. The improvement went on, and today, months after I was supposed to be in my grave, I am not only happy, well, and alive, but my blood pressure is down. I know one thing for certain. The doctor's prediction would certainly have come true if I had gone on thinking dying thoughts of defeat, but I gave my body a chance to heal itself by nothing in the world but a change of mental attitude. Let me ask you a question. If merely acting cheerful and thinking positive thoughts of health and courage could save this man's life, why should you and I tolerate for 1 minute more our minor glooms and depressions? Why make ourselves and everyone around us unhappy and blue when it's possible for us to start creating happiness by merely acting cheerful? Years ago, I read a little book that had a lasting and profound effect on my life. It was called As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. And here's what it said. A man will find that as he alters his thoughts toward things and other people will alter towards him. Let a man radically alter his thoughts, and he will be astonished at the rapid transformation it will effect in the material conditions of his life. Men do not attract that which they want, but that which they are. The divinity that shapes our ends is in ourselves. It is our very self. All that a man achieves is the direct result of his own thoughts. A man can only rise, conquer, and achieve by lifting up his thoughts. He can only remain weak and abject and miserable by refusing to lift up his thoughts. According to the book of Genesis, the Creator gave man dominion over the whole wide earth, a mighty big present. But I'm not interested in any such super-royal prerogatives. All I desire is dominion over myself, dominion over my thoughts, dominion over my fears, dominion over my mind and over my spirit. And the wonderful thing is that I know I can attain this dominion to an astonishing degree any time I want to, by merely controlling my actions, which in turn control my reactions. So let us remember these words of William James. Much of what we call evil can often be converted into a bracing and tonic good by a simple change of the sufferer's inner attitude, from one of fear to one of fight. Let's fight for our happiness. Let's fight for our happiness by following a daily program of cheerful and constructive thinking. Here is such a program. It is entitled Just for Today. I found this program so inspiring that I gave away hundreds of copies. It was written by the late Sybil F. Partridge. If you and I follow it, we will eliminate most of our worries and increase immeasurably our portion of what the French call la joie de vivre. Just for today. 1. Just for today, I will be happy. This assumes that what Abraham Lincoln said is true, that most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. Happiness is from within. It is not a matter of externals. 2. Just for today, I will try to adjust myself to what is, and not try to adjust everything to my own desires. I will take my family, my business, and my luck as they come, and fit myself to them. 3. Just for today, I will take care of my body. I will exercise it, care for it, nourish it, not abuse it nor neglect it, so that it will be a perfect machine for my bidding. 4. Just for today, I will try to strengthen my mind. I will learn something useful. I will not be a mental loafer. I will read something that requires effort, thought, and concentration. 5. Just for today, I will exercise my soul in 3 ways. I will do somebody a good turn and not get found out. I will do at least 2 things I don't want to do, as William James suggests, just for exercise. 6. Just for today, I will be agreeable. I will look as well as I can, dress as becomingly as possible, talk low, act courteously, be liberal with praise, criticize not at all, nor find fault with anything, and not try to regulate nor improve anyone. 7. Just for today, I will try to live through this day only, not to tackle my whole life problem at once. I can do things for 12 hours that would appall me if I had to keep them up for a lifetime. 8. Just for today, I will have a program. I will write down what I expect to do every hour. I may not follow it exactly, but I will have it. It will eliminate 2 pests, hurrying and indecision. 9. Just for today, I will have a quiet half-hour all by myself and relax. In this half-hour, sometimes I will think of God, so as to get a little more perspective into my life. 10. Just for today, I will be unafraid. Especially, I will not be afraid to be happy, to enjoy what is beautiful, to love, and to believe that those I love me. If we want to develop a mental attitude that will bring us peace and happiness, here is Rule 1. Think and act cheerfully, and you will feel cheerful. Chapter 13. The High Cost of Getting Even. One night years ago, as I was traveling through Yellowstone Park, I sat with other tourists on bleachers facing a dense growth of pine and spruce. Presently, the animal which we had been waiting to see, the terror of the forest, the grizzly bear, strode out into the glare of the lights and began devouring the garbage that had been dumped there from the kitchen of one of the park hotels. A forest ranger, Major Martindale, sat on a horse and talked to the excited tourists about bears. He told us that the grizzly bear can whip any other animal in the western world, with the possible exception of the buffalo and the Kodiak bear. Yet I noticed that night that there was one animal, and only one, that the grizzly permitted to come out of the forest and eat with him under the glare of the lights: a skunk. The grizzly knew that he could liquidate a skunk with one swipe of his mighty paw. Why didn't he do it? Because he had found out from experience that it didn't pay. I found that out, too. As a farm boy, I trapped 4-legged skunks along the hedgerows in Missouri, and as a man, I encountered a few 2-legged skunks on the sidewalks of New York. I have found out from sad experience that it doesn't pay to stir up either variety. When we hate our enemies, we're giving them power over us, power over our sleep, our appetites, our blood pressure, our health, and our happiness. Our enemies would dance with joy if only they knew how they were worrying us, lacerating us, and getting even with us. Our hate is not hurting them at all, but our hate is turning our own days and nights into a hellish turmoil. Who do you suppose said this? If selfish people try to take advantage of you, cross them off your list, but don't try to get even. When you try to get even, you hurt yourself more than you hurt the other fellow. Now, those words sound as if they might have been uttered by some starry-eyed idealist, but they weren't. Those words appeared in the bulletin issued by the police department of Milwaukee. How will trying to get even hurt you? In many ways. According to Life magazine, it may even wreck your health. The chief personality characteristic of persons with hypertension, high blood pressure, is resentment, said Life. When resentment is chronic hypertension and heart trouble follow. So you see that when Jesus said, "Love your enemies," he was not only preaching sound ethics, he was also preaching 20th century medicine. When he said, "Forgive 70 times 7, Jesus was telling you and me how to keep from having high blood pressure, heart trouble, stomach ulcers, and many other ailments. A friend of mine recently had a serious heart attack. Her physician put her to bed and ordered her to refuse to get angry about anything, no matter what happened. Physicians know that if you have a weak heart, a fit of anger can kill you. Did I say can kill you? A fit of anger did kill a restaurant owner in Spokane, Washington, a few years ago. I have in front of me now a letter from Jerry Swarthout, then chief of the police department, Spokane, Washington, saying, "A few years ago, William Falkaber, a man of 68 who owned a cafe in Spokane, killed himself by flying into a rage because his cook insisted on drinking coffee out of his saucer. The cafe owner was so indignant that he grabbed a revolver and started to chase the cook and fell dead from heart failure, with his hand still gripping the gun. The coroner's report declared that anger had caused the heart failure. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," he was also telling us how to improve our looks. I know people, and so do you, whose faces have been wrinkled and hardened by hate and disfigured by resentment. All the cosmetic surgery in Christendom won't improve their looks half so much as would a heart full of forgiveness, tenderness, and love. Hatred destroys our ability to enjoy even our food. The Bible puts it this way: "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." Wouldn't our enemies rub their hands with glee if they knew that our hate for them was exhausting us, making us tired and nervous, ruining our looks, giving us heart trouble, and probably shortening our lives? Even if we can't love our enemies, let's at least love ourselves. Let's love ourselves so much that we won't permit our enemies to control our happiness, our health, and our looks. As Shakespeare put it, "Heat not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself." When Jesus said that we should forgive our enemies 70 times 7, he was also preaching sound business. For example, I have before me as I write a letter I received from George Rona of Uppsala, Sweden. For years, George Rona was an attorney in Vienna, but during the Second World War he fled to Sweden. He had no money, needed work badly. Since he could speak and write several languages, he hoped to get a position as correspondent for some firm engaged in importing or exporting. Most of the firms replied that they had no need of such services because of the war, but they would keep his name on file, and so on. One man, however, wrote George Rona a letter saying, "What you imagine about my business is not true. You are both wrong and foolish. I do not need any correspondent. Even if I did need one, I wouldn't hire you, because you can't even write good Swedish. Your letter is full of mistakes." When George Rona read that letter, he was as mad as Donald Duck. What did this Swede mean by telling him he couldn't write the language? Why, the letter that this Swede himself had written was full of mistakes. So George Rona wrote a letter that was calculated to burn this man up. And then he paused. He said to himself, "Wait a minute now. How do I know this man isn't right? I have studied Swedish, but it's not my native language, so maybe I do make mistakes I don't know anything about. If I do, then I certainly have to study harder if I ever hope to get a job. This man has possibly done me a favor, even though he didn't mean to. The mere fact that he expressed himself in disagreeable terms doesn't alter my debt to him. Therefore, I am going to write him and thank him for what he has done." So George Rona tore up the scorching letter he had already written and wrote another that said, "It was kind of you to go to the trouble of writing to me, especially when you do not need a correspondent. I am sorry I was mistaken about your firm. The reason that I wrote to you was that I made inquiry, and your name was given to me as a leader in your field. I did not know I had made grammatical errors in my letter. I am sorry and ashamed of myself. I will now apply myself more diligently to the study of the Swedish language and try to correct my mistakes. I want to thank you for helping me get started on the road to self-improvement." Within a few days, George Rona got a letter from this man asking Rona to come to see him. Rona went and got a job. George Rona discovered for himself that a soft answer turneth away wrath. We may not be saintly enough to love our enemies, but for the sake of our own health and happiness, let's at least forgive them and forget them. That is the smart thing to do. "To be wronged or robbed," said Confucius, "is nothing unless you continue to remember it." I once asked General Eisenhower's son John if his father ever nourished resentments. "No," he replied, "Dad never wastes a minute thinking about people he doesn't like." There's an old saying that a man is a fool who can't be angry, but a man is wise who won't be angry. That was the policy of William J. Gaynor, a former mayor of New York. Bitterly denounced by the press, he was shot by a maniac and almost killed. As he lay in the hospital fighting for his life, he said, "Every night I forgive everything and everybody." Is that too idealistic? Too much sweetness and light? If so, let's turn for counsel to the great German philosopher Schopenhauer, author of Studies in Pessimism. He regarded life as a futile and painful adventure. Gloom dripped from him as he walked, yet out of the depths of his despair Schopenhauer cried, "If possible, no animosity should be felt for anyone." I once asked Bernard Baruch, the man who was the trusted advisor to 6 presidents, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, and Truman, whether he was ever disturbed by the attacks of his enemies. "No man can humiliate me or disturb me," he replied. "I won't let him." No one can humiliate or disturb you and me either, unless we let him. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Throughout the ages, mankind has burned its candles before those Christ-like individuals who bore no malice against their enemies. I have often stood in the Jasper National Park in Canada and gazed upon one of the most beautiful mountains in the Western world, a mountain named in honor of Edith Cavell, the British nurse who went to her death like a saint before a German firing squad on October 12, 1915. Her crime? She had hidden and fed and nursed wounded French and English soldiers in her Belgian home and had helped them escape into Holland. As the English chaplain entered her cell in the military prison in Brussels that October morning to prepare her for death, Edith Cavell uttered 2 sentences that have been preserved in bronze and granite. "I realize that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone." 4 years later, her body was removed to England, and memorial services were held in Westminster Abbey. I once spent a year in London. I have often stood before the statue of Edith Cavell opposite the National Portrait Gallery and read her immortal words carved in granite. "I realize that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone." One sure way to forgive and forget our enemies is to become absorbed in some cause infinitely bigger than ourselves. Then the insults and the enmities we encounter won't matter, because we will be oblivious of everything but our cause. As an example, let's take an intensely dramatic event that was about to take place in the pine woods of Mississippi back in 1918, a lynching. Lawrence Jones, a black teacher and preacher, was about to be lynched. Some years ago I visited the school that Lawrence Jones founded, the Piney Woods Country School, and I spoke before the student body. That school is nationally known today, but the incident I'm going to relate occurred long before that. It occurred back in the highly emotional days of the First World War. A rumor had spread through central Mississippi that the Germans were arousing the blacks and inciting them to rebellion. Lawrence Jones, the man who was about to be lynched, was, as I have already said, a black himself and was accused of helping to arouse his race to insurrection. A group of white men, pausing outside the church, had heard Lawrence Jones shouting to his congregation, "Life is a battle in which every black must gird on his armor and fight to survive and succeed." Fight, armor. Enough. Galloping off into the night, these excited young men recruited a mob, returned to the church, put a rope around the preacher, dragged him for a mile up the road, stood him on a heap of kindling, lighted matches, and were about to hang him and burn him at the same time when someone shouted, "Let's make the blankety-blank-blank talk before he burns." Speech! Speech! Lawrence Jones, standing on the kindling, spoke with the rope around his neck, spoke for his life and his cause. He had been graduated from the University of Iowa in 1907. His sterling character, his scholarship, and his musical ability had made him popular with both the students and the faculty. Upon graduation, he had turned down the offer of a hotel man to set him up in business, and had turned down the offer of a wealthy man to finance his musical education. Why? Because he was on fire with a vision. Reading the story of Booker T. Washington's life, he'd been inspired to devote his own life to educating the poverty-stricken, illiterate members of his race. So he went to the most backward belt he could find in the South, a spot 25 miles south of Jackson, Mississippi. pawning his watch for $1.65, he started his school in the open woods with a stump for a desk. Lawrence Jones told these angry men who were waiting to lynch him of the struggle he had had to educate these unschooled boys and girls and to train them to be good farmers, mechanics, cooks, housekeepers. He told of the white men who had helped him in his struggle to establish Piney Woods Country School, white men who had given him land, lumber, and pigs, cows, and money to help him carry on his educational work. When Lawrence Jones talked with sincere and moving eloquence as he pleaded not for himself but his cause, the mob began to soften. Finally, an old Confederate veteran in the crowd said, "I believe this boy is telling the truth. I know the white men whose names he has mentioned. He's doing fine work. We have made a mistake. We ought to help him instead of hang him." The Confederate veteran passed his hat through the crowd and raised a gift of $52.40 from the very men who had gathered there to hang the founder of the Piney Woods Country School, the man who said, "I have no time to quarrel, no time for regrets, and no man can force me to stoop low enough to hate him." Epictetus pointed out 19 centuries ago that we reap what we sow, and that somehow fate almost always makes us pay for our malefactions. In the long run, said Epictetus, every man will pay the penalty for his own misdeeds. The man who remembers this will be angry with no one, indignant with no one, revile no one, blame no one, offend no one, hate no one. Probably no other man in American history was ever more denounced and hated and double-crossed than Lincoln. Yet Lincoln, according to Herndon's classic biography, never judged men by his like or dislike for them. If any given act was to be performed, he could understand that his enemy could do it just as well as anyone. If a man had maligned him or had been guilty of personal ill-treatment and was the fittest man for the place, Lincoln would give him that place just as soon as he would give it to a friend. I do not think he ever removed a man because he was his enemy or because he disliked him. Lincoln was denounced and insulted by some of the very men he had appointed to positions of high power, men like McClellan, Seward, Stanton, and Chase. Yet Lincoln believed, according to Herndon, his law partner, that no man was to be eulogized for what he did or censured for what he did or did not do, because all of us are the children of conditions, of circumstances, of environment, of education, of acquired habits, and of heredity, molding men as they are and will forever be. Perhaps Lincoln was right. If you and I had inherited the same physical, mental, and emotional characteristics that our enemies have inherited, and if life had done to us what it has done to them, we would act exactly as they do. We couldn't possibly do anything else. Let's be charitable enough to repeat the prayer of the Sioux Indians. O Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging and criticizing a man until I have walked in his moccasins for 2 weeks. So, instead of hating our enemies, let's pity them and thank God that life has not made us what they are. Instead of heaping condemnation and revenge upon our enemies, let us give them our understanding, our sympathy, our help, our forgiveness, and our prayers. I was brought up in a family which read the Scriptures or repeated a verse from the Bible each night, and then knelt down and said family prayers. I can still hear my father in a lonely Missouri farmhouse repeating these words of Jesus, words that will continue to be repeated as long as man cherishes his ideals. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. My father tried to live those words of Jesus, and they gave him an inner peace that the captains and the kings of earth have often sought for in vain. To cultivate a mental attitude that will bring you peace and happiness, remember that Rule 2 is, let's never try to get even with our enemies, because if we do, we will hurt ourselves far more than we hurt them. Let's do as General Eisenhower does. Let's never waste a minute thinking about people we don't like. Chapter 14. If you do this, you will never worry about ingratitude. I recently met a businessman in Texas who was burned up with indignation. I was warned that he would tell me about it within 15 minutes after I met him. He did. The incident he was angry about had occurred 11 months previously, but he was still burned up about it. He couldn't talk of anything else. He had given his 34 employees $10,000 in Christmas bonuses, approximately $300 each, and no one had thanked him. "I am sorry," he complained bitterly, "that I ever gave them a penny." "An angry man," said Confucius, "is always full of poison." This man was so full of poison that I honestly pitied him. He was about 60 years old. Now, life insurance companies figure that on the average we will live slightly more than 2/3 of the difference between our present age and 80. So this man, if he was lucky, probably had about 14 or 15 years to live. Yet he had already wasted almost one of his few remaining years by his bitterness and resentment over an event that was past and gone. I pitied him. Instead of wallowing in resentment and self-pity, he might have asked himself why he didn't get any appreciation. Maybe he'd underpaid and overworked his employees. Maybe they considered a Christmas bonus not a gift, but something they had earned. Maybe he was so critical and unapproachable that no one dared or cared to thank him. Maybe they felt he gave the bonus because most of the profits were going for taxes anyway. On the other hand, maybe the employees were selfish, mean, and ill-mannered. Maybe this, maybe that. I don't know any more about it than you do. But I do know that Dr. Samuel Johnson said, "Gratitude is a fruit of great cultivation. You do not find it among gross people." Here's the point I'm trying to make. This man made the human and distressing mistake of expecting gratitude. He just didn't know human nature. If you saved a man's life, would you expect him to be grateful? You might, but Samuel Leibowitz, who was a famous criminal lawyer before he became a judge, saved 78 men from going to the electric chair. How many of these men do you suppose stopped to thank Samuel Leibowitz or ever took the trouble to send him a Christmas card? How many? Guess. That's right, none. Christ helped 10 lepers in one afternoon, but how many of these lepers ever stopped to thank him? Only one. Look it up in St. Luke. When Christ turned around to his disciples and asked, "Where are the other 9?" they had all run away, disappeared without thanks. Let me ask you a question. Why should you and I, or this businessman in Texas, expect more thanks for our small favors than was given Jesus Christ? And when it comes to money matters, well, that's even more hopeless. Charles Schwab told me that he once saved a bank cashier who had speculated in the stock market with funds belonging to the bank. Schwab put up the money to save this man from going to the penitentiary. Was the cashier grateful? Oh, yes, for a little while. Then he turned against Schwab and reviled him and denounced him, the very man who kept him out of jail. If you gave one of your relatives $1 million, would you expect him to be grateful? Andrew Carnegie did just that. But if Andrew Carnegie had come back from the grave a little while later, he would have been shocked to find this relative cursing him. Why? Because old Andy had left $365 million to public charities and had cut him off with one measly million, as he put it. That's how it goes. Human nature has always been human nature, and it probably won't change in your lifetime, so why not accept it? Why not be as realistic about it as was old Marcus Aurelius, one of the wisest men who ever ruled the Roman Empire? He wrote in his diary one day, "I am going to meet people today who talk too much, people who are selfish, egotistical, ungrateful, but I won't be surprised or disturbed, for I couldn't imagine a world without such people." That makes sense, doesn't it? If you and I go around grumbling about ingratitude, who is to blame? Is it human nature, or is it our ignorance of human nature? Let's not expect gratitude. Then, if we get some occasionally, it will come as a delightful surprise. If we don't get it, we won't be disturbed. Here's the first point I'm trying to make in this chapter. It is natural for people to forget to be grateful. So if we go around expecting gratitude, we're heading straight for a lot of headaches. I know a woman in New York who's always complaining because she's lonely. Not one of her relatives wants to go near her, and no wonder. If you visit her, she'll tell you for hours what she did for her nieces when they were children. She nursed them through the measles and the mumps and the whooping cough. She boarded them for years. She helped to send one of them through business school, and she made a home for the other until she got married. Do the nieces come to see her? Oh, yes, now and then, out of a spirit of duty, but they dread these visits. They know they will have to sit and listen for hours to half-veiled reproaches. They will be treated to an endless litany of bitter complaints and self-pitying sighs. And when this woman can no longer bludgeon, browbeat, or bully her nieces into coming to see her, she has one of her spells. She develops a heart attack. Is the heart attack real? Yes. The doctors say she has a nervous heart, suffers from palpitations. But the doctors also say they can do nothing for her. Her trouble is emotional. What this woman really wants is love and attention, but she calls it gratitude. And she will never get gratitude or love because she demands it. She thinks it's her due. And there are thousands of people like her, people who are ill from ingratitude, loneliness, and neglect. They long to be loved, but the only way in this world that they can ever hope to be loved is to stop asking for it and to start pouring out love without hope of return. Does that sound like sheer, impractical, visionary idealism? It isn't. It's just horse sense. It's a good way for you and me to find the happiness we long for. I know. I have seen it happen right in my own family. My own mother and father gave for the joy of helping others. We were poor, always overwhelmed with debts, yet poor as we were, my father and mother always managed to send money every year to an orphan's home, the Christian home in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Mother and father never visited that home. Probably no one thanked them for their gifts except by letter, but they were richly repaid, for they had the joy of helping little children without wishing for or expecting any gratitude in return. After I left home, I would always send father and mother a check at Christmas and urge them to indulge in a few luxuries for themselves, but they rarely did. When I came home a few days before Christmas, Father would tell me of the coal and groceries they'd bought for some widow woman in town who had a lot of children and no money to buy food and fuel. What joy they got out of giving these gifts, the joy of giving without expecting anything whatever in return. I believe my father would almost have qualified for Aristotle's description of the ideal man, the man most worthy of being happy. The ideal man, said Aristotle, takes joy in doing favors for others. Here's the second point I'm trying to make in this chapter. If we want to find happiness, let's stop thinking about gratitude or ingratitude and give for the inner joy of giving. Parents have been tearing their hair about the ingratitude of children for 10,000 years. Even Shakespeare's King Lear cried out, "How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child." But why should children be thankful, unless we train them to be? Ingratitude is natural, like weeds. Gratitude is like a rose. It has to be fed and watered and cultivated and loved and protected. If our children are ungrateful, who's to blame? Maybe we are. If we have never taught them to express gratitude to others, how can we expect them to be grateful to us? I knew a man in Chicago who had cause to complain of the ingratitude of his stepsons. He slaved in a box factory, seldom earning more than $40 a week. He married a widow, and she persuaded him to borrow money and send her 2 grown sons to college. Out of his salary of $40 a week, he had to pay for food, rent, fuel, clothes, and also for the payments on his note. He did this for 4 years, working like a coolie and never complaining. Did he get any thanks? No. His wife took it all for granted, and so did her sons. They never imagined that they owed their stepfather anything, not even thanks. Who was to blame? The boys? Yes, but the mother was even more to blame. She thought it was a shame to burden their young lives with a sense of obligation. She didn't want her sons to start out under debt, so she never dreamed of saying, "What a prince your stepfather is to help you through college." Instead, she took the attitude, "Oh, that's the least he can do." She thought she was sparing her sons, but in reality she was sending them out into life with the dangerous idea that the world owed them a living. And it was a dangerous idea, for one of those sons tried to borrow from an employer and ended up in jail. We must remember that our children are very much what we make them. For example, my mother's sister, Viola Alexander of Minneapolis, is a shining example of a woman who never had cause to complain about the ingratitude of children. When I was a boy, Aunt Viola took her own mother into her home to love and take care of, and she did the same thing for her husband's mother. I can still close my eyes and see those two old ladies sitting before the fire in Aunt Viola's farmhouse. Were they any trouble to Aunt Viola? Often, I suppose. But you never would have guessed it from her attitude. She loved those old ladies. She pampered them and spoiled them and made them feel at home. In addition, Aunt Viola had 6 children of her own, but it never occurred to her that she was doing anything especially noble or deserved any halos for taking those old ladies into her home. To her, it was the natural thing, the right thing, the thing she wanted to do. Now, where is Aunt Viola today? Well, she's now been a widow for 20-odd years, and she has 5 grown-up children, 5 separate households, all clamoring to share her and to have her come and live in their homes. Her children adore her. They never get enough of her. Out of gratitude? Nonsense. It is love, sheer love. Those children breathed in warmth and radiant human kindness all during their childhoods. Is it any wonder that now that the situation is reversed, they give back love? So let us remember that to raise grateful children, we have to be grateful. Let us remember little pitchers have big ears, and watch what we say. To illustrate, the next time we're tempted to belittle someone's kindness in the presence of our children, let's stop. Let's never say, "Look at these dishcloths Cousin Sue sent for Christmas. She knit them herself. They didn't cost her a cent." The remark may seem trivial to us, but the children are listening. So instead we'd better say, "Look at the hours Cousin Sue spent making these for Christmas. Isn't she nice? Let's write her a thank you note right now." And our children may unconsciously absorb the habit of praise and appreciation. To avoid resentment and worry over ingratitude, here is Rule 3. A. Instead of worrying about ingratitude, let's expect it. Let's remember that Jesus healed 10 lepers in one day, and only 1 thanked him. Why should we expect more gratitude than Jesus got? B. Let's remember that the only way to find happiness is not to expect gratitude, but to give for the joy of giving. C. Let's remember that gratitude is a cultivated trait. So if we want our children to be grateful, we must train them to be grateful.